But one of the things that stood out to me was I was going through the census data, because I always like the census voter registration data because it historically has been more accurate, generally speaking, than anybody else. Better than exit polling, better than Roper Center, better than the American National Election Survey done. All of that, when they've done voter validated studies and surveys, they found the census is by far the most accurate. And the first thing I was curious about was, generally speaking, the census tends to get pin on the nose. The number of people they report voting corresponds to the number of ballots counted. I mean, usually only very small differentials between the presidential election and the number that the census reports voting. And in that, like, to give an example, they reported about 137 million voters in 2016 having voted. That was almost exactly the number who
almost
voted.
Dead on.
So before the election, during the preview series here, I said I thought there'd be 150 million to 152 million votes, depending on New York, Illinois, and California, that Trump would get 75 million. And I thought Biden would get somewhere around 75 million, up to 77, depending on those big states. And so where I was surprised was, almost 159 million ballots get counted. Well, the census data comes in, and it only has 154 million people having voted, which is 5 million less than the total number of ballots that got counted.
It's Joe Biden's margin, Robert.
It was about exactly the 5 million votes.
Margin.
Exactly. It was like, it's the 5 million votes that I said, man, I don't know where those votes came from. Well, apparently the census can't find them either. So according to is the media going to claim the census is liberal, is conservative Trumpish bias, when almost all census workers are Democrats? So, again, this is a very thorough, very comprehensive 2016, pin it on the nose. Why are there 5 million more ballots counted in the presidential election than reported voting, according to the census data, which has almost always been accurate? And when it's been off, it has tended to overestimate the number of votes, not underestimate the number of votes. So this is one of the biggest gaps in census history since they've been doing this since 1964. And isn't it amazing that it's almost exactly the number of questionable Biden ballots? Like, to give an example, in Georgia, there's about remember we mentioned there was 100,000 overvote, that only people who somehow only voted for the presidency, no other office. Well, the census says only about 4.8 million or so voted in Georgia, but they counted about 5 million votes. So you see almost to the number the kind of error in some of these key critical states. And then when you dig into the demographics, the internal data, the number of the people who voted, it's 154 million total, thereabouts, and usually there's a 1.5 million drop off between all votes, and there's some people who vote for something other than the presidency. It's not a big number, but it's always about 1 million to 2 million, that cap. So they basically have about 150, 253 million presidential votes. You look at the internal demographics, and it's almost exactly what we forecast prior to the election. The surge in turnout was amongst working class whites, not other groups, according to the census data. Now, where it gets interesting is there's unusual turnout amongst young whites and some college educated voters that the census doesn't show is actually saying they voted. Yet the ballots were apparently counted from those precincts and regions. So,
and Robert, all of the people who have for years, after exit polls come out, everybody who we've gotten into these fights for over two decades, wait for the census data to come out. Forget about the exit polls. What a shocker. George W. Bush could not have won 44% of the Hispanic vote. And then in 2008, well, it wasn't really everything everybody said. It was still a surge in turnout, of course, but Barack Obama just got votes from young people and African Americans at higher rates. They voted at higher rates. 2012 rolls around. Mitt Romney, who we're going to talk about here in a second, is missing about 3 to 6 million white voters, depending on where you're looking around the country. And guess what? It wasn't really this surge in Hispanic vote share like everybody was talking about. In fact, their share went down and black vote share went up. So, everybody has long said, wait for the census and then we'll talk about what really happened, right? Now, of course, it's the census must be making a blunder here. You know what? This is an acceptable difference in the number of estimated votes. No, it's not. No, it is not.
what we predicted in terms of working class white turnout surging is what the polling data is, what the census data shows. It's not only that, we predicted the racial gap would be the biggest it had been in a while, that white non-Hispanic vote would be double digits higher turnout wise than African American vote. That's precisely what the census reports. So the census reports slightly higher Latino turnout than I expected, but nothing major. Otherwise, it's almost to the T what we predicted prior to the election. And the only gap is the extra 5 million votes that came in from somewhere that the census say didn't vote.
Didn't happen.
So it's fascinating, but it's also educational about Trump and Trumpism and populism, that he got the highest working class white turnout in modern election history in recent census history since the 70s. I mean, you have to go back to the 1960s to find higher working class white turnout in a presidential election. And so all of the dynamics that we predicted is what the census says came true. It's as good of evidence as you possibly could have that there were 5 million ballots that are questionable ballots, that are disputed ballots, that the census itself says are counting votes of people who claim they did not vote. And
you know, we had Matt on Inside the Numbers on Friday. We had Matt Brainerd on, and we talked about it. And I said, look, you know, as numbers guys, we can't say for certainty, Robert, because we don't know exactly how some people voted. But what he said, well, I will say that the number of questionable ballots not able to verify, they are not legal, exceed the margin in all these battleground states. And the report on Wisconsin's coming out. When I looked up indefinitely confined, I found that it was like a couple of thousand. He said sometimes in what he researched, it was as low as a few hundred for an election, but I didn't go back that far. So maybe whatever. And he's saying, it was 190,000 of them, almost 185 plus. This is crazy, Robert, that we're not even, and here we are having this discussion again, but that we're not supposed to have it. Right? We're not supposed to have this discussion where then there are all these anomalies yet again. All right. This is something Patrick Basham said on Mark Levin after the election when he was on Life, Liberty, and Levin. For everything to be on the up and up, we have to accept that all of these other things, which are typically far more predictive and far more accurate, we have to accept that they're not only all wrong at the same time, but they are all wrong for the first time ever in some cases. You know, so this is just too much for me. And as a numbers guy, I can't say, well, in Michigan, that would have been it. Well, in Wisconsin, that would have actually in Wisconsin more and more. I'm you know, that was just so close. That to me, that's right there with Georgia and Arizona. And for the first time ever, a sitting president gets the highest number of votes ever and loses. It's the first sitting president to increase the total number of votes he got and still loses. He's the first president to carry Ohio and Florida overwhelmingly and still loses. It just doesn't, folks, I don't really know what else to say here. This doesn't make sense. And I would have expected the census to overcount a little, Like I was expecting them to come out a couple, maybe 2 million above what we.
And historically, that's because there's certain groups, particularly Democratic leaning groups, as it turns out,
that over participate.
That claim they voted when they didn't. So that, like when they've done voter validated surveys, so they match up the demographics and match up the files that the census has with vote, and they've done extensive, expansive ones over decades. They found that the census, that the only time it makes a mistake is if the census doesn't. People over-report their voting. Well, the only group that under-reports their voting are your working class white voters. I mean, they're almost ashamed to have said they voted in the last election in some context. but otherwise, African American voters, younger voters, and professional class voters all over-report. And what they're showing, like for example, there was about a 20% jump in turnout rate amongst high school educated whites. Right. Whereas there was only about a 4% jump amongst college and post-college educated whites. Yet you're seeing different precinct results in some of those places, which suggests to me there's almost no chance those people lied about, they're not ashamed of having voted in this election for sure. So anybody that said, what that means is that, your apartment buildings, your nursing home complexes in new suburban areas, exurban areas, those kind of areas, that's where you're likely seeing a lot of questionable voting. And it likely came from, places where one person could organize a bunch of ballots and send them back in, even for people who didn't vote. And I think that's what a lot of Matt Brainerd's research documents. That's what your research documents. But now we have the United States Census Bureau confirming that there were 5 million more votes counted than they found voters in this last election.
And so many Republicans wanted to focus on urban centers. And I know Matt's research shows the same thing as ours. It wasn't, take Michigan, which is the most known example from us, and like him, this isn't the same as what some other people, some statistical chart that comes. These are records, verifiable records, names of people and addresses.
These are not people playing algorithms on their computer in ways they don't understand.
That's right.
There's
exactly, Robert.
Sadly.
I'm not talking about just Wayne County. Everybody wants to focus it. They want to target inner cities, which allow Democrats to say it's a race thing, right? That's not where we found a lot of this.
No.
Wayne County is big and was the greatest, I would say, a repeat offender, including very same clerk and precinct, right? But Kent County, right? Parts of Macomb County and southern Macomb, where it's getting to be more built up, right?
It's where there's a disproportionate number of big apartment complexes and nursing homes. Yeah. And that's not in your core inner cities. That's in your near suburban, exurban areas.
Exurbs. Yeah. That's right. That's right. I mean, I just, and again, so this is all happening. I see Rasmussen putting out these tweets. They're absolutely right. So you're only supposed to be a Republican who's concerned about this. Our surveys have shown the same thing. That's just simply not true. I mean, 30% of Democrats in Georgia told us they believe Donald Trump won that state, but they just don't care. They'll take the W. You know what I mean? I mean, that may be a little bit sick, but for the most part, across the board, people are worried about what happened this last election. And it's not just, I tweeted this in response. It's not just like the white Republican voter who can't give this up. The people building the non-white, newly naturalized citizens who are building my subdivision don't believe it. They're not letting go of it. Every time a new dumpster is dropped off to remove materials, these big, construction dumpsters, what are they paying on it, Laura?
Trump 2020.
They're not letting it go. These are people from, Latin American countries that some of them have been here for years and are just naturalized. They're not, or Biden, right? And they're not letting this go. And we are now in the month of May, the beginning of the month of May, and there are people who are, they're holding that much to it. Hi folks, Rich Baris, the People's Pundit, host of Inside the Numbers with the People's Pundit, and co-host of What Are the Odds with Barnes and Baris. If you liked what the New York Post called above average transparency, then go ahead and like the page, share the videos, and hit that notification bell. It'll let you know when we're going to go live.